Welcome, everyone. I'm Jim O'Loughlin of the Department of Languages and Literatures at the University of Northern Iowa, where the North American Review is housed. Thrilled to have such a great turnout tonight for this event. Only sorry we can't all be together in person, but we've learned to adapt as need be. Tonight's event, I want to say, I think of in some ways a continuation of the border crossing series that we held last year. We're thrilled to have Martina Espada back virtually, if not in person again. And I will just make one very quick plug. If you're someone out there who is looking for a next step, think about what you want to do, and you might be interested in getting involved with the North American Review, I'm just going to put a link on the chat. And then I will turn things over to Jeremy Schraffenberger, one of the editors of the North American Review, who will take things from here. So thanks again. Thanks for coming out, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thank you all for joining the North American Review. Thanks for the Department of Languages and Literatures for co-sponsoring this event. Thanks for coming to celebrate the first day of National Poetry Month. And I can't think of anyone I would rather have here to celebrate poetry than Martina Espada. I think the only thing that I would look forward to more is happening tomorrow when I get my second vaccine shot in the afternoon. But I'm really happy to kick off National Poetry Month here tonight. I'm Jeremy Schraffenberger, as Jim said, editor of North American Review and a professor of English at University of Northern Iowa. Before I introduce Martine, I want to remind a few people of a few things. First, you can order his new book on bookshop.org, and I'm dropping a link into the chat for everyone. And I would really encourage you to use that link to buy the book, because bookshop.org is a organization that supports local independent bookstores. You can also, by the way, use that chat box to post questions throughout the reading as they occur to you. Questions you have for Martine, please do. I will be gathering them as he reads, and then at the end of his reading, I will be trying to read them out loud. I might call on you if you want to read it out loud if we have time, but please do use the chat function. Also, you should be able to turn your camera on, in which case you can also use the little reaction buttons down in the bottom of Zoom to clap, to give a thumbs up, to celebrate. I encourage you to do that. You need to have your camera on to do so. So please do. Martine is kind enough to read for us tonight, and to see faces is probably really helpful for him to have an audience that he can actually see. But please do use the chat for questions, comments, bravos, or the clap and applaud function too. Finally, you've registered for this event, and in so doing, you also registered for a chance to win a broadside that Martina signed. This is a broadside of his poem, How We Could Have Lived or Died This Way. It's what I consider the quintessential Black Lives Matter poem of our day. It's from his previous collection, Vivas to Those Who Have Failed. The poem appeared in the pages of the North American Review in the summer of 2015. The broadside was designed and printed by Julie Russell Stewart. I'm going to put another link in the box here. She runs a place called Caveworks Press. So she designed and printed it, dropped a link that will take you to a page that will describe her process of designing it, also allow you to buy a copy of your own if you don't win. The winner is actually, I'm happy to announce, I'm putting it in the chat box here because I had it randomly drawn. Say congratulations to Lynn Potts. Lynn, are you here? Whoa. Congratulations, Lynn. I will contact you after the reading by email to get an address to mail it to you. Okay, so this week I've been preparing to introduce Martina Espada, one of my heroes in poetry, and I've realized, even though I've read all of your work, I'm very familiar with work. It's a daunting task because your work has meant so much to me over the years. It's kind of like being asked to introduce your own soul or something, because I think of his poetry as not just inspiring, it's also inspiriting. It's animating, it's alive and enlivening, and it's taught me time and time again the power of poetry over the years. And so this is why back in 2015, He was the first person that we thought of to come to celebrate our bicentennial and be a keynote at our conference. And then, he was kind enough also to serve as one of our contributing editors at NAR. And he was also kind enough, he was the first person we thought of to invite back in 2019 for another conference when we were celebrating 50 years at the University of Northern Iowa. I've been honored to have published some of his words in our pages and to have collaborated with him on various projects over the years. But I want to tell a little brief story instead of just talking about the things that I've been involved with him in particular. Years ago, I was teaching a class in graduate school called the American Poet Laureate. And I tasked my students with not reading all the work of the laureates, but to find for themselves and argue for a contemporary poet that was their personal poet laureate, a poet who spoke to them and moved them, whose work that they thought was important, that we should pay attention to. And so many students were fighting over Martine as their laureate. We had to agree to share him as our laureate, the class poet laureate, the people's laureate. And the first textbook we adopted, almost like we were ratifying a constitution, was the Republic of Poetry, which of course, you'll know, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize that year. One of many, many honors and prestigious awards that he's received for his vast body of work. He's written 20 books as poet editor, more than 20 books as poet editor, translator, essayist, the most recent of which, Floaters, was just published by Norton and from which he'll be reading tonight. I look forward to hearing him read and then having a conversation afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Marti Espada.
Buenas noches. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to Jeremy Schraffenberger for everything. That introduction, his brilliant essay on floaters in the North American Review online, and the organization of this evening hosted by the North American Review. I also want to thank Jim O'Loughlin from the North American Review as well. And above all, without a doubt, I want to thank my wife, Lauren, who is here tonight and who is present on every single page of this book. I'm going to read 6 poems. Doesn't sound like much, but it is. I'm going to start with the title poem, Floaters. 2 Salvadoran migrants, father and daughter, who came to be known as Oscar and Valeria, were drowned crossing the Rio Grande in June of 2019. A photograph of their bodies went viral, sparking outrage, sparking grief, and sparking trutherism. There was a post in the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group charging that the photo was faked. This poem speaks to the photograph and to these charges. Floaters takes its title from the term used by certain members of the Border Patrol to describe those who drown crossing over. So we'll begin here. Floaters. Epigraph. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask, have y'all ever seen floaters this clean? I'm not trying to be an ass, but I have never seen floaters like this. Could this be another edited photo? We've all seen the Dems and liberal parties do some pretty sick things. Anonymous post. I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group. Like a beer bottle thrown into the river by a boy too drunk to cry. Like the shard of a styrofoam cup drained of coffee brown as the river. Like the plank of a fishing boat broken in half by the river, the dead float. And the dead have a name. Floaters, say the men of the Border Patrol, keeping watch all night by the river, hearts pumping coffee as they say the word floaters, soft as a bubble, hard as a shoe as it nudges the body to see if it breathes, to see if it moans, to see if it sits up and speaks. And the dead have names. A feast day parade of names, names that dress all in red, names that twirl skirts, names that blow whistles, names that shake rattles, names that sing in praise of the saints. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. See how they rise off the tongue. The calling of bird to bird somewhere in the trees above our heads, trilling in the dark heart of the leaves. Say what we know of them now they are dead. Oscar slapped dough for pizza with oven-blistered fingers. Daughter Valeria sang, banging a toy guitar. He slipped free of the apron he wore in the blast of the oven, sold the motorcycle he would kick till it sputtered to life, counted off pesos for the journey across the river, and the last of his 25 years, and the last of her 23 months. There is another name that beats its wings in the heart of the trees. Say, Tanya Manesa Avalos, Oscar's wife and Valeria's mother, the witness stumbling along the river. Now their names rise off her tongue. Say, Oscar y Valeria. He swam from Matamoros across to Brownsville, the girl slung around his neck, stood her in the weeds on the Texas side of the river, swore to return with her mother in hand, turning his back as fathers do, who later say, I turned around and she was gone. In the time it takes for a bird to hop from branch to branch, Valeria jumped in the river after her father. Maybe he called out her name as he swept her up from the river. Maybe the river drowned out his voice as the water swept them away. Tanya called out the names of the saints, but the saints drowsed in the stupor of birds in the dark, their cages covered with blankets. The men on patrol would never hear their pleas for asylum, watching for floaters. Hearts pumping coffee all night on the Texas side of the river. No one, they say, had ever seen floaters this clean. Oscar's black shirt yanked up to the armpits, Valeria's arm slung around her father's neck, even after the light left her eyes, both face down in the weeds back on the Mexican side of the river. Another edited photo. See how her head disappears in his shirt, the waterlogged diaper bunched in her pants, the blue of the blue cans. The radio warned us about the crisis actors we see at one school shooting after another. The man called, Oscar will breathe, sit up, speak, tug the black shirt over his head, shower off the mud, and shake hands with the photographer. Yet the floaters did not float down the Rio Grande like Olympians showing off the backstroke, nor did their souls float up to Dallas, land of rumored jobs and a president shot in the head as he waved from his motorcade. No bubbles rose from their breath in the mud, light as the iridescent circles of soap that would fascinate a 2-year-old. And the dead still have names. Names that sing in praise of the saints, names that flower in blossoms of white, a cortege of names dressed all in black, trailing the coffins to the cemetery. Carve their names in headlines and gravestones they would never know in the kitchens of this cacophonous world. Enter their names in the book of names. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. Bury them in a corner of the cemetery named for the sainted Archbishop of the Poor, shot in the heart saying Mass, bullets bought by the taxes I paid when I worked as a bouncer and fractured my hand 40 years ago, and bumper stickers read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. When the last bubble of breath escapes the body, may the men who speak of floaters, who have never seen floaters this clean, float through the clouds to the heavens, where they paddle the air as they wait for the saint who flips through the keys on his ring like a drowsy janitor, till he fingers the key that turns the lock and shuts the gate on their babble-tongued faces, and they plunge back to earth, a shower of hailstones pelting the river, the Mexican side of the river. And so we begin there. 30 years ago, I was a tenant lawyer with Su Clínica Legal, legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in Chelsea, Massachusetts, right across the Mystic Tobin Bridge from Boston. My clients came from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, and also Central America, especially El Salvador and Guatemala. In other words, the same people crossing the border today, fleeing the same countries left in ruins by Reagan's wars. The second half of this poem refers to the notorious Chuck Stewart murder case in Boston, and it is called Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I close my eyes and see him windmilling his arms as he plummets from the Mystic Tobin Bridge, to prove me wrong, to show me he was good, to atone for sins like seeds in the lopsided apple of his heart, but mostly to escape from me in the back of his cab, a Puerto Rican lawyer in a suit and tie. I hated the 111 bus, sweltering in my suit and tie with the crowd in the aisle, waiting to hit a bump on the Mystic Tobin Bridge so my head would finally burst through the ceiling like a giraffe on a circus train. I hated the 111 bus after eviction day in Chelsea District Court, translating the landlords and judges into Spanish so the tenants knew they had to stuff their clothing into garbage bags and steal away again. Away from the 40-watt squint that followed them everywhere, that followed me because I stood beside them in court. I would daydream in the humidity of the bus, a basketball hero flipping the balled up pages of the law into the wastebasket at the office of the legal aid lawyers chanted my name. I hated the 111 bus. I had to take a taxi cab that day. "What the hell are you doing here?" said the driver of the cab to me in my suit and tie. "You gotta be careful in this neighborhood. There's a lot of Jose's around here." The driver's great-grandfather staggered off a boat so his great-grandson could one day drive me across the Mystic Tobin Bridge, but there was no room in the taxi for chalk and a blackboard. He could hear the sawing of my breath as I leaned into his ear, past the bulletproof barricade somehow missing, and said, "I'm a Jose." I could see the 40-watt squint in his rearview mirror. "I'm Puerto Rican," I said. It was exactly 5 p.m., and we were stuck in traffic in a taxi on the Mystic Tobin Bridge. The driver stammered his own West Side story without the ballet, how a Puerto Rican gang stole his cousin's wallet years ago. "You think I'm going to rob you?" I said in my suit and tie, close enough now to tickle his ear with the mouth of a revolver. I could hear the sawing of his breath. He still wanted to know what I was doing there. "I'm a lawyer. I go to court with all the Jose's." I said. Stalled traffic steamed around us, the breath of cattle in the winter air. Where you going for the holidays? The driver said. I thought about Christmas Eve in court, eviction orders flying from the judge's bench when tenants without legal aid lawyers or children old enough to translate the English of the summons did not answer to their names. Every year, the legal aid lawyers told the joke about the Christmas defense. Your Honor, it's Christmas. I said to the driver, I will be spending Christmas right here with my fellow Jose's. The driver shouted, What do you want me to do? Get out of this cab and jump off the bridge? We both knew what he meant. We both knew about Chuck Stewart, the last man to jump off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. Everybody knew how Chuck drove his wife to Mission Hill after birthing classes to flash and pop in the dark when he shot her in the head and himself in the belly. Everybody knew how he conjured a black carjacker on the crackling call to 911 the way the Mercury Theater on the air conjured Martians in New Jersey on the radio half a century before. Everybody knew how 100 cops pounded on door after door in the projects of Mission Hill, locking a black man in a cage for the world to see like the last of his tribe on exhibit at the World's Fair. Everybody knew how Chuck would have escaped cashing the insurance check to drive away with a new Nissan, but for his brother's confession, the accomplice throwing the Gucci bag with makeup, the wedding rings, and the gun off the dizzy bridge in Revere. Everybody knew how Chuck parked his new car on the lower deck, left a note, and launched himself deep into the black water, how the cops hauled his body from the river by lunchtime when I walked into the office to tell the secretary Chuck Stewart just jumped off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I said nothing to the driver. I almost nodded yes in the rearview mirror. I confess, for a flash, I wanted him to jump. The driver, the cops, the landlords, the judges, all wanted us to jump off the Mystic Tobin Bridge, all wanted us to sprout gills like movie monsters so we could paddle underwater back to the islands, down into the weeds and mud at the bottom, past the fish-plucked rib cages of the dead, the rusty revolvers of 1,000 crimes unsolved, the wedding rings of marriages gone bad, till we washed up on shore in a tangle of seaweed, gasping for air. Last night, still more landed here, clothing stuffed in garbage bags to flee the god of hurricanes flinging their houses into the sky, or the god of hunger slipping his knife between the ribs, not a dark tide like the tide of the Mystic River, but builders of bridges. You can walk across the bridges they build, or you can jump. Well, times of hate call for poems of love. There are love poems in this book. This poem starts with hate and ends with love. It's from my wife, Lauren, who makes an appearance in the last stanza in Italy. I was born in the East New York section of Brooklyn, but somehow ended up in Valley Stream, Long Island as an adolescent, and that's when the trouble started. This poem, another bridge poem, standing on the bridge at Docacqua. Epigraph. My only love sprung from my only hate. Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 5. At 40, I studied the mirror. I poked my mouth to free a trapped grain of hamburger, and a tooth broke off between my fingers. I felt nothing. The dentist said, "The tooth is dead. The root is dead. The x-rays show signs of trauma to the lower jaw. What happened here?" I said, "Donald de Blasio." Donald de Blasio punched me in the mouth. I was 15. My lip split, my skull clanged, and my body smacked the floor like a mannequin in a store looted by rioters. He stood over me and grinned as he would grin at me for the rest of my life. Whenever I saw him in the hallway at school or on the street, he would pump his right fist in my face, slowly curling an invisible barbell. He was a centurion guarding the last outpost of the empire, another Sicilian or Calabrese fleeing Brooklyn for Valley Stream, Long Island, escaping the barbarians who sacked Rome back from the dead in 1972 to steal their cars, torch their houses, piss in their swimming pools, stab the boys, and kiss the girls. I was a barbarian drifting far from his tribe, a Puerto Rican without a knife in hand or a leather jacket ablaze in gang colors. Everybody understood, even the teacher who glanced away the day I was late and sat on the floor so the front row could take turns jabbing a shoe in my spine. I refuse to worship their gods, Jesus on the crucifix, or the Yankees in the sacred arena of the stadium, or the football deity who could bench press 300 pounds and slam me into a locker whenever he saw me. He never said a word to me. I never said a word to him. I learned to swallow blood and words. For years, I would mimic their rooster strut, the sneering lips stuck out, the bellowing battle cry of Bafagul. I rooted against Rocky in all the Rocky movies, cheering his choreographed pratfalls to the canvas. When they rushed out the door of the pizza joint to gawk at the booming car wreck on the corner, leaving my eggplant parm sub to burn black in the oven, I called them Goombas and swore never to return. I am 60. The words flow over the wrinkled stone of my brain. Dolce acqua, sweet water, fresh water, River Nervia in the province of Imperia, region of Liguria. I stand on the bridge at Dolce acqua, the same stone arch painted by Monet more than a century ago. She contemplates the water gushing below the bridge, and I watch at her shoulder to see the river as she sees the river. Poet, teacher, amati, like amada in Spanish, the word for beloved. Her mother's name is Giovio Calabrese from New Jersey. Her grandfather, a stone mason, before the beam rammed his head and the stroke crippled his right hand. Her great-grandmother, a girl sewing buttons onto blouses who escaped the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire as others leapt hand in hand, eyes shut, from the 9th floor. I can no longer remember the curses in the poetry of Shakespeare and Donald de Blasio. She takes my hand and leads me across the bridge to the ruins of the castle on the other side of the river, through the labyrinth of stone, up to the jagged battlements where we listen to the silence of the builders and the birds and the silence again. I don't even think I've ever read that one in public before. I see that Paul Mariani is here. Jeremy's essay is about this book, The Bridges from Dolce Acqua to Brooklyn. and Paul Mariani, a poet, biographer of poets, great friend, and human being. We almost lost him a few years ago, and he wrote a poem about that. I wrote this tribute to him using his last line as my title and quoting his poem elsewhere in my poem as well. Be there when they swarm me, for Paul Mariani. You were once the boy of the big shoulders, hauling cartons of Campbell's soup at the A.M.P. in 1959, yearning to brain the boss with a wrench. You were the poet of the great handshake and all the stories, squeezing my arm to tell me about Hart Crane, who leapt from a ship to drown at sea. Did he struggle to regain the surface, suddenly sobered by what he'd done? I wandered lonely as a Puerto Rican in an English department, and you found me in the hallway, calling me brother as my own brother never would, calling me poet as if that word had never drowned at sea. Once I was a boy with big shoulders too, plotting to shrink-wrap the foreman's head the night of the layoffs. Not for you, the poet learning to smoke like a poet, bursting into tears at the sight of a mayonnaise jar because he loves the letter M, locking himself in the bathroom because his haiku is too short. Now, you tell tales of the hospital bed, your spine a wreck, your wobbling brain. Now, you write of scrubbing the deck when hornets sting and zoom into your eyes as one winged fiend multiplies by 20 and you win, but no, you cannot win, and so you pray, be there when they swarm me. I wear a leg brace up to the knee. The surgeons open my belly like curious children inspecting the pendulum of a grandfather clock. My insurance will not pay for my hearing aids. At the airport, they stop me because my beard is a suspect. And yet, I will be there when they swarm you. I will arm myself against the hornets with natural insecticides, the eucalyptus oil, the citronella, the spray of chrysanthemum flower tea, and then the baseball bat. Since I was born in Brooklyn, where people used baseball bats to smash burglars, cars, television screens, anything but baseballs. We will win, though we know we cannot win. You called me brother in the hallway as my brother never would, spoke the word poet like a benediction. And so we wait together for the next wave of winged demons. Be there when they swarm me. So that's for Paul. Now more than ever, we need the visionaries, especially visionaries who roll up their sleeves and get to work. Luis Cardenas Costa was a dear friend and mentor, an inspired and inspiring organizer who co-founded El Puente, yes, the bridge, a multi-service community center in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, also known as Los Sures. I was in law school when he took me to an abandoned church to share his dream. And that's where this poem comes from. It's called Morir Soñando, to die dreaming. Morir Soñando for Luis Cardenas Costa, 1945 to 2019, Brooklyn, New York. I saw the empty cross atop the empty church on South 4th Street, as if Jesus flapped his arms and flew away, spooked by one ambulance siren too many. I saw the stained glass windows I wanted to break with a brick, the mural of St. Mary and the angels hovering innocent as spies over the congregation, and wanted to know why you brought me here, the son of a man punched in the face by a priest for questioning the Trinity, who punched him back. This is el puente, you said, the bridge. I knew about the Williamsburg Bridge, 8 lanes of traffic and the subway stampeding in the open windows of the barrio all summer. You spread your arms in that abandoned church and saw the spinning of a carousel better than any wooden horses pumping up and down at Coney Island. Here, the ESL classes for the neighbors cursed with swollen tongues in English. There, the clinics on contraception, the pestilence in the veins of the unsuspecting. Here, the karate lessons, feet spearing the air to keep schoolyard demons away. There, the dancers in white swirling their skirts to the drumming of bomba. Here, the workshops on Puerto Rican history, La Masacre de Ponce, where your mother's beloved painted his last words on the street with a fingertip of blood. I was a law student, first year, memorizing law school Latin, listening to classical guitar on my boombox. I studied the rules of property. It's mine. It's not yours. I saw only what could be proven by a preponderance of the evidence. The church abandoned by the church, a cross atop the church abandoned by the Son of God. My belly empty as St. Mary of the Angels. I told you I was hungry, and we left. I wanted Chinese food, but you told me about the Chinese takeout down the block where you stood behind a man who shrieked about the price of wonton soup, left and returned with a can of gasoline, splashed it on the floor, and pulled a box of kitchen matches from his pocket. Will you wait till I pick up my egg roll and pork fried rice? You said, with a high school teacher's exasperated authority. So he did. You could talk an arsonist into postponing his inferno till you left with lunch. But you couldn't raise the dead in the ER at Greenpoint Hospital, even in your suit and tie. You couldn't convince the girl called Sugar to rise from the gurney after the gunshot drained the blood from her body. You couldn't persuade the doctor who peeled his gloves and shook his head to bring her back to life, telling him, "Do it again." An arsonist in medical scrubs trying to strike a wet match. You couldn't jump-start the calliope in her heart so the carousel of horses would rise and fall and rise again. Whenever you saw the gutted church, you would see the sheets of the gurney dipped in red, all the gurneys rolling into the ER with a sacrifice of adolescence. We walked to the luncheonette on Havemeyer Street. A red awning announced, "Morir soñando." To die dreaming, you said, from the DR, my father's island. The boy at the counter, who spoke no English, brown as my father, called Marti like me, grinned the way you grinned at El Puente once, St. Mary of the Angels. He squeezed the oranges into a drizzle of juice with evaporated milk, cane sugar, and ice, shook the elixir, and poured it till the froth spilled over the lip of the glass. Foam freckled my snout as I raised my hand for another. Intoxicated by Morir Soñando number 3 and the prophet gently rocking at my table, I had a vision. ESL classes healing the jaws wired shut, by English, clinics full of adolescents studying the secrets of the body, unspeakable in the kitchen or the confessional, karate students landing bare feet on the mat with a thump and grunt in unison, bomba dancers twirling to a song in praise of Yoruba gods abolished by the priests, the words of Puerto Rican rebels painted on the walls by brushes dipped in every color, pressed in the pages of notebooks by a generation condemned to amnesia. Morir soñando. Luis, I know you died dreaming of South 4th Street, the banners that said no to the toxic waste plant down the block, or the Navy bombarding an island of fishermen for target practice thousands of miles away. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the gigantes, carnival mascaras bristling with horns that dangle with the angels at El Puente. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the next El Puente. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the hammer's claw, the drill whining to the screw, the dust like snow in a globe, then the shy genius raising her hand in the back of the room. Morir soñando. I know you died dreaming of the poets who stank of weed in the parking lot, then stood before the mic you electrified for them and rubbed their eyes when the faces in their poems gathered there, waiting for the first word so we could all die dreaming. Morir soñando, intoxicated by the elixir of the tongue. Oh, rocking prophet at my table. And I'll finish my reading in this portion of the program with this poem. Letter to my father. My father, Francisco Luis Espada, Frank Espada, was born in the mountain town of Utuado, Puerto Rico in the year 1930 and died in Pacifica, California in 2014. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017, I suddenly saw Utuado over and over again on television, on the internet, in the headlines. As John Lee Anderson put it in the New Yorker, Utuado had, quote, become a byword for the island's devastation. At least 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico, according to one study. Some say as many as 4,000. I started talking to my father, who died 3 years before. Actually, I started talking to his ashes in a box, and that was the genesis of this last poem, Letter to My Father, October 2017. You once said, my reward for this life will be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you, next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life, so I know you are not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. When I was a boy, you were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned, "He's killing me!" At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy, and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, my grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw a banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit, and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, "You came from another planet. How'd you do it?" You said, "Every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains." Every morning, I see the mountains. And Utuado, three sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales who only left the house for church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the fourth sister to stagger into the street screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. In Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, so the trees in his garden beheaded all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. In Utuado, a welder and a handyman rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying above so many hands that raised a sign that told the helicopters, "Campamento Los Olvidados," Camp of the Forgotten. Los Olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tarp to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with the spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, "These people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die." The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo, Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. Down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once if Puerto Rico needed to be free, and you said, "Tres pulgadas de sangre en la calle." 3 inches of blood in the street. Now, 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada swinging machetes to clear the road might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die, and yet I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. Thunder Spanish obscenities in his face. Banish him to a roofless rainstorm in Utuado so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you, white box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes. En Utuado. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martine. Thank you, everyone. Keep giving it up for Martine. Throw in a celebration there. I want you to write some questions in the chat as you have them. I've collected a few over the course of Martine's reading, but please do add them in there. I'm going to start out by asking a question of my own. And actually, this is, I'll put a link in the chat to this interview, Martine, that you recently did with Salon online. Wonderful interview. And you mentioned in that interview the irony right now that we exist in this world surrounded by words, that we're buried in them, we're drowning in them, drowning in language and image. And yet you say, in the absence of words that matter, we hunger for words that matter. Now, last night, I was watching a documentary about the phenomenon of QAnon, yet one more gift from the age of Trump. And it occurs to me that the proliferation of conspiracy theory itself is another deep need for meaning, a hunger for words that matter. And of course, I couldn't help but think when you said that in the interview about your anthology, What Saves Us, which is right here from Curbstone Books. And you talk about how poets need to take back language, resisting the corruption of words themselves. That's what in your introduction you wrote about. So I would love for you to hear what you have to say about the war of language against language right now, and how you can describe poetry's power to resist that corruption.
Poets have been resisting the corruption of language, especially the corruption of language by those in power, as long as we have had poets. I think, for example, of Wilfred Owen, the great poet of World War I, who wrote a poem called Dulce decorum est. And of course, that phrase comes from the larger phrase, Dulce decorum est pro patria amore, which in turn comes from another poet, Horace, ancient Roman poet. And it means, roughly translated, how sweet and decorous it is to die for one's country. Wilfred Owen was so incensed by the use of that language, not only by the poet Horace, but by those who urged those in England to act against their own interests, to volunteer for this war that was unprecedented at the time in human history, and to die in the trenches, that he wrote this poem in response. It's an argument with Horace. It's an argument with the corruption of language. Parenthetically, it's also an argument with another poet by the name of Jesse Pope, who was writing patriotic doggerel during the war. But Wilfred Owen was so outraged by the corruption of language in the service of power and in the service of warfare that he wrote one of the greatest anti-war poems in the English language a little over a century ago. And in that poem, you can see the balance between the ornate Latin phrase, that propagandistic phrase, and the simple phrase that Owen uses to refute it, the old lie, capital L. The old lie is still with us. And it takes the form in our times of hyper euphemism. And we inherited many hyper euphemisms from the Trump years. Everybody remembers alternative facts. That one's going to be with us for a while, right? And there were so many examples of that kind. And yes, we now need the language of poetry more than ever, but the language, as Wilfred Owen described it, which is truthful. That's why the true poets must be truthful, he said in the preface to his posthumous collection of poems. Of course, he was killed in the last week of that war. Right? We still need that. We still need poets to come forward and not only speak truth to power, but speak truth to the powerless also. Right? This is something that we are called upon to do, and I think the poets do it well.
Well, speaking of military action, I have a question here from Camila Perez Bustillo, who's here, and he put a link in the chat to visit witnessattheborder.org, which I would highly recommend you do. I'm going to read his question for him, however. He writes, amid all the massacres and murders of migrants at the hands of Mexican police and military continue, your voice continues to be uniquely powerful and committed in defense of migrants everywhere, including the border. What are you thinking as you see the images and hear the voices today of those held at over a dozen detention sites throughout the country, including several border patrol holding facilities, convention centers, and military bases, never intended to detain children, and of those who continue to be expelled without regard or mercy? Where do you draw hope and indignation from as these crimes continue on both sides of the border?
What do I think? What's it going to take? That's what I think. What's it going to take? If we can see image after image of these kids locked up, and they are locked up. If you can't come and go as you please, you're in jail. So these kids are locked up. And let's keep in mind when we see these images of young children or adolescents who are in these camps, in these so-called facilities, that the vast majority of them have family in this country. They aren't simply wandering across the border like a kid, wandering across a playground. The vast majority have family in this country and are trying to join that family. If not family, they have guardians. This is what I struggle with, among many other things. It's why are they being thrown into these places at all? Why can't we do everything we do? Why can't we take our resources as a society, whether they are monetary resources or human resources, and put them at service of our fellow human beings on the border? Why are we talking about borders at all? It's an invisible line. On the other side of that line, there are human beings. Once they cross that line, they're still human beings, and they're human beings in need. And you know who put them in need? We did. All you have to do is look at the history of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the history of this country and its intervention in Central America, the military interventions, the economic interventions, the interventions that continue to the present day as we prop up the governments that will collapse without us, and who then in turn brutalize their own people. And we wonder why they're crossing the border. Who did it? We did it. And it's time for us to take responsibility, moral responsibility, ethical responsibility for our history and pay some of it back. This country likes cheap bananas. This country likes cheap coffee. And the price the people of Central America have paid for well over a century is a price they have paid in blood. By contrast, what they ask of us now is so small. What they ask of us now is only to be as human as they are. And when are we going to recognize that this is one of those questions we ask of ourselves as a people? When it comes to the border, who are we? Who are we as a society? And what kind of mirror do we hold up to ourselves when we allow this to happen in our name day after day after day? And they are dying. Make no mistake. Maybe we are not saying their names, but there are all kinds of death, and there are all kinds of anonymity. And we hold that mirror up to ourselves. Is that mirror empty? Are we vampires? or are we human beings just like those people at the border? How about it?
So there are a few more questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask one of my own. I reviewed your book for the North American Review, and at the risk of being shamelessly self-plugging, I put a link to it in the chat box. And I wrote this review, Martine, I don't know if you knew this, when I was in Wisconsin in a house on a lake that we rented to get away. Just, I think everyone kind of needs some space to get away nowadays. And on my way up north, I passed an exit. Your book was sort of teeming in my brain the entire drive up there. And I passed an exit for a town called Linden. And of course, I was thinking of your work, and I kind of smiled because I thought immediately of the Linden projects where you grew up in Brooklyn, that apartment 14F that recurs not just in this book, but throughout your whole body of work. It just appears time and time again, the sort of mythic place that we return to. Can you talk about the importance of that place, how it shaped you then in your memory through poetry, but also right now, how it continues to shape you, thinking about that as a formative location?
Well, first of all, you know, I want to I wanted to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this program, that that's a brilliant piece. It's a brilliant essay. And Lauren knows I don't go around saying that when people write about my work. I'm quite cantankerous, as a matter of fact. You know, an enthusiastic review isn't good enough for me. You know, there are reviews that are enthusiastic and well intentioned, and they're simply not well written, and they're not particularly observant. This is a brilliant piece of writing. It could have been about anything. It's a brilliant piece of writing, and you can read it on the website of the North American Review. As far as I'm concerned, it should have been on the front cover of the New York Times Book Review instead of the usual claptrap. So let's begin with that. Isn't it also interesting how well attuned Jeremy's ear is for language? Linden projects. Oh my goodness. Doesn't that sound pretty? The Linden projects. This sounds almost ethereal. It reminds me of my grandmother. Lived in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico, in a public housing development called, I'm not making this up, Jardines del Paraíso, the Gardens of Paradise. It wasn't. You know, I would sit with my grandmother, and she would point out that, oh yeah, that's where they sell the drugs over there. So, again, we're dealing with euphemisms, right? And I grew up, with in a household where my father understood the difference, the substantial difference between where we were and where we should have been. So when we talk about what the East New York section of Brooklyn meant to me and still means to me, part of it was that. I remember jokingly saying to my father once, I bet you didn't know you were poor growing up. And he looked at me, and, he had a way of looking right through me. And he said, I always knew. Well, I always knew we were, we were in the projects, and I always knew we were in the East New York section of Brooklyn. And I knew there was another world out there. I could see it on television. Found out about it as an adolescent, took a bit of a beating for it, as you heard in one of those poems earlier this evening. But you think about any place that is the place where you were born and the place where you spent your entire childhood. That place defines you for the rest of your life. And sometimes people, when they see my subject matter, when they see how often I write about working people, about the working class, wonder why I do it. And I've had people say to me things like, well, you're not working class. You're a lawyer, for God's sake. You're a professor, for Christ's sake. And then I had to point out that, that imprint is always going to be there. If you're born into that kind of community, and my father was a civil rights activist, but he wasn't always paid to do that. When I was born, he was a draftsman for an electrical contracting company, and he hated it. He hated that job because what he really wanted to do was organize this community, and he was so good at it that he did eventually become a paid organizer, paid activist. But that shapes you. It shapes you forever. Obviously, it does. You know, I compared notes a few years ago with a friend from East New York, and I only have the one. Her name is Marie McQueen, and she was working at the time we encountered each other as an editor for Consumer Reports, and we actually met in the old neighborhood and took a walk through it, and we were talking as we went, and I said, "What is it? How are we different from everybody else?" And she said, "People who come from here have an edge." She said, "People who come from here know that a lack of respect can have serious consequences up to and including death." And I said, "Oh, that's where the edge comes from." Because anybody who knows me knows I'm edgy, and I have too much of an edge. I bring the edge into circumstances where I don't need it, because I'm always going to be that kid from the East New York section of Brooklyn.
You're also always from Matuado in a way too, and that place is another one that comes to mind as central in all of your work. It's sort of like another place in your poetic imagination that recurs. And when I read your poems, I go to Brooklyn, I go to Puerto Rico, and you are known as a poet of political imagination. You're a narrative poet, you're a storyteller, poet of witness, poet of advocacy. I don't know if people call you a poet of place, but I think that phrase is fitting for you, even though it's sometimes used as a shorthand for nature poetry or environmental poetry. But in your hands, the places shift. You're telling stories of the place by telling your stories and what's happened there. And I'm thinking too about some of these places that you write about. It's not just the people, like what happens there. It is what happened there. It's the deep history of the scars that remain in the place. There are some poems where you find these places that are transformed in a way where I'm thinking of the Charleston Prison poem, for instance, that is now the Bunker Hill Community College, which makes me think about using place as a kind of site for visionary thinking. Like, how do you reimagine the history of a place by thinking about its visionary future? I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I could also pull some things from the chat if you like.
Yeah, I can respond to that quickly, and then we could pull something from the chat. You mentioned Utuado, which, as I say, as I said before I read that last poem, is a town in the mountains of Puerto Rico, the Cordillera Central. And for me, that's kind of a mythic place. I wasn't born there, I didn't grow up there, but it means a great deal to me because it was the place where my father was born, a place that he and I returned to together. So we made a pilgrimage, or more than one pilgrimage there. And you have to imagine the contrast between the East New York section of Brooklyn, the Linden Projects, and the mountains of Puerto Rico, and the way that blew my mind the first time I went there at the age of 11. I mean, I think my brain must have exploded out my ear. And to realize that I was the product of these two wildly desperate places and disparate histories. And with the history of Puerto Rico, well, it's the oldest colony in the world. 4 centuries under Spain and now more than a century under the United States. I really hope the next 500 years is better than the last 500 years.
There are a lot of students joining us for the reading today, some of whom I suspect write poetry. Some of them either are mine or were mine, who I see here. And I'm reminded of your poem because one of the students who's currently attending asks about advice you might have. And I think of your poem, Advice to Young Poets from the Republic of Poetry. Very short poem. Do you want me to read it? You could probably
Um,
hear it.
well, if you want to read it, you can read it, or I can.
It's never pretend to be a unicorn by sticking a plunger on your head, which I always get a kick out of in that book. But
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And people have often asked me, what does that mean? And I gotta make a confession here. It doesn't mean a hell of a lot.
yeah,
But once I gave it some thought, because I was asked over and over again, what does that mean? Advice to young poets: never pretend to be a unicorn by sticking a plunger on your head. Well, first of all, it's a documentary poem that actually happened to a student of mine at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And she showed up for class and she was wearing a great big hat. And I said, Kathy, why are you wearing a great big hat on your head? And she whipped the hat off and she had a great big dark circle on her forehead. And I said, Kathy, why do you have a great big dark circle on your forehead? She said, I got a plunger stuck on my head. And I said, Kathy, how did you get a plunger stuck on your head? And she said, well, I went home and my roommate was in the bathroom and she was sticking a plunger on her head and pulling it off and sticking the plunger on her head and pulling it off and saying, look at me, I'm a unicorn. And so I said, I want to do that. And I stuck the plunger on my head and I couldn't get it off. And then we cried and we prayed, and then we went to the emergency room and they put some Vaseline on my head and the plunger popped off with a loud pop. And I said, that's a poem. And so it turned out to be. Now, once I thought it through, the surreal incident behind the poem aside, I believe what I'm trying to say there is simply this, as another poet put it: this above all, to thine own self be true. And that was Shakespeare,
very
and
good.
now it's also coming from me, albeit in a slightly less elegant form.
Well, maybe we can squeeze in one more from the chat, and then we'll wrap it up here. It's a very simple question asking if there's a writer you feel deserves more attention or who you want to recommend to this group. I see a few of them on the screen right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, there, we were talking earlier about, talking about Jeremy, talking about Paul Mariani. I can't see everybody who's here, I can only see one screen. But I think, for a long time, people would ask me about influences and I would give the expected answers. And then I realized it was more important for me to talk about poets that nobody was talking about. And so oftentimes now when people ask me about influence, who we should be reading, I mention the name of Jack Agueros, Agueros, Jack Agueros. Jack Agueros was a Puerto Rican poet born in East Harlem in 1934, and he died in Chelsea's section of Manhattan in 2014. He was like my second father. In point of fact, my actual father and Jack died within a few months of each other. And Jack was a poet, and he was an essayist. He was a short story writer. He was the translator of Julia de Burgos, the most beloved poet from the island of Puerto Rico. And Jack was a remarkable raconteur, wonderful storyteller. As I said, a second father. There is a poem in this book, Floaters, which is dedicated to him. It's called Flan, and it's about the moment that I figured out that Jack was suffering from Alzheimer's. And how the sense of guilt and regret I felt, or not realizing at first what the hell was going on, because who does, And then years later, I was able to pay him tribute in this poem called Flan. And while I was talking, my wife Lauren, who's been dropping links in the chat all night, and I want to thank her for that, just dropped a link to Jack's obituary in the New York Times. Earlier, there was a link about my father as well, if you want to know more about both of them. You know, two very influential people in my life. And Puerto Ricans on top of that. What do you know?
Well, thank you so much, Martine. I am going to end the evening by asking everyone to unmute. I think I can give you the power to unmute, and then we'll have a raucous moment. Unless, Martine, you have something to say?
Should we say something about the book?
Yes. Floaters. I put a link in the chat to buy it at bookshop.org. We can drop it in there one last time. Click on it, buy it. Buy more than one copy. Here is the link to the chat.
Yeah. And thank you especially for directing people to bookshop.org.
It's a great organization.
Now, please
Now
don't
let's
let me interrupt
unmute
you.
and thanks, Martine.